Welcome to First Look, Washington Post Live's one-stop shop for news and analysis. I'm Jonathan Capehart, associate editor at the Washington Post. Yesterday was an historic day in American history. Donald Trump was found guilty on all 34 counts by a unanimous vote of a jury of his peers in the hush money election interference case brought by the Manhattan District Attorney, making Trump the first former president of the United States convicted of a crime and a convicted felon. Covering the trial from the beginning has been Perry Stein, Justice Department reporter for the Washington Post. Perry, welcome to First Look.
Thanks so much for having me.
Okay, Perry, what was the prosecution's argument in the case?
Right, so the prosecution, they built sort of this narrative from start to finish that Trump wanted these stories when he was running for election in 2016. He wanted the National Enquirer. He had a deal for them to sort of kill all negative stories about him and promote good ones about him. And so we've had that from the start. And then what they did was they showed once that Access Hollywood, that infamous Access Hollywood tape came out, that where Trump said you could do whatever you want to women, then they really got nervous about this Stormy Daniels story. And that is when they really needed to make sure it didn't come out. So they built this narrative from the start of why they wanted the Stormy Daniels story not to happen and what Trump and his team was willing to do to make sure that it didn't get out to the public. And then they had Michael Cohen as the kind of the closing hitter who kind of put together all the little pieces that prosecutors had already laid out that put Trump, said, no, this wasn't Trump's people that did this. This was Trump himself who orchestrated this and wanted the story not to come out, and then repaid Michael Cohen and falsified business records to hush it up. So I think it was a story they built.
Okay, and so before I go to the defense, since you brought up Michael Cohen, I'm wondering how significant was the jury's request to revisit tabloid publisher David Pecker's testimony, and what did that say about the relevance of Michael Cohen's time on the stand during the trial?
Yeah, I mean, we can't say for sure, right, what the relevance is, but I do think it showed that what David Pecker had a couple of conversations or a couple points in his testimony, which is what they seem to want to revisit, which kind of showed Trump's involvement, Trump's knowledge potentially, not just of the Stormy Daniels payment, but of his involvements in getting stories killed about him in general. So it showed that they were really interested in linking Trump. They had questions about linking Trump to this crime.
All right, so then what was the Trump legal team's best argument in the case, and why do you believe the jury rejected it?
Yeah, I mean, their best argument was probably that they thought that the people who told this, Michael Cohen, was a liar, right? That was their best hope, was to make sure that the jury did not believe Michael Cohen. They said this story is Michael Cohen is the only person that really puts Trump at in this crime, and you should not believe Michael Cohen. So that was a big part of their defense. They also, to do that, tried to show Trump, he was so busy as president. How could he even have known that these payments were coming through his desk? He signs everything because as a president, he has so much to do.
Defendants rarely take the stand in their own defense, usually for fear they'll make things worse on cross-examination or under cross-examination. But in retrospect, should Trump have taken the stand to defend himself?
I guess we'll never know that butterfly effect, but I do think that, people caution defendants from taking the stand all the time, especially Trump. I mean, I think the argument is that the only person could have really refuted Michael Cohen's testimony was probably Trump himself or Alan Weisselberg, who this is the CFO who's in jail right now. But, they would have, think about this, right? Trump is denying that he ever had any sexual relations with Stormy Daniels. He has publicly denied that over and over again. All the evidence laid out that the jury heard for weeks pointed to the fact that, well, it seems they had a sexual encounter. The first thing that he would have been asked on the stands is, did you have a sexual encounter with Stormy Daniels? Potentially. And then if he had said no, then that also throws into his credibility. So there was a lot of reasons why not to. That was just one small example. But, maybe the jury would have bought him. I don't know. People have a lot of opinions about Trump. So I don't know how the jury would have felt if he took the stand.
Mm-hmm. Sentencing of Donald Trump is set for July 11th. That's just a few days before the start of the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee. What are the parameters of the penalty that Judge Merchan can consider?
So up to 4 years, I believe, in prison he could get, but that does seem fairly unlikely because, right, Trump, you have to consider his age. You have to consider, is he a convicted felon? He's not does he have, I'm sorry, now he is, but does he have any prior convictions? The answer is no. So all these things point to, this is also the lowest class felony in New York. So, I think it's unlikely that he gets jail time. It's certainly possible, but he could also get probation. So that means that he would have to get permission from a probation officer to travel out of state. He could be president and have to get permission from a probation officer to travel out of state. I don't know the details of how that would work. Or they could say, pay a fine and don't commit a crime again, or you'll have to see me again. So it goes from severe to less severe. But don't forget, if he's found guilty in any of his other trials, his 3 other trials, if they go to trial, he will be a convicted felon. And that judge, if he is found guilty in the next trial, would have to consider, right, that he is a convicted felon already.
All right, you mentioned the other trials. There are 3 other trials that we're looking at. There's the election interference case in Georgia, the classified documents case, and the federal election interference case. When might those trials start? When might Georgia start? Then classified documents, then election interference, in that order?
I will say, I wish I knew. So Georgia, right now, some of the Fani Willis stuff is caught up in appeals. That doesn't even have a date. I would bet, well, I would never bet a lot of money, but a little bit of money that will not be happening before the election. Classified documents, we are at an indefinite postponement on that one. Judging by the pretrial schedule that Judge Cannon, it was supposed to be for May. She recently formally canceled that date and then set a bunch of other pretrial deadlines. All of those that take you to late summer suggest that would also be very hard to happen before the election. So then you get to DC. That's the federal election interference case. That is the one that is currently on hold. Because the Supreme Court is considering whether it wants to, how it wants to answer Donald Trump's claim that presidential immunity suggests that he cannot be prosecuted for the allegations in that indictment. Once the Supreme Court makes that ruling, which, it could, we're starting to get this season's rulings already, so it could happen at the end of this month or so, that could put that trial back in play for before the election.
Of the remaining 3, which of the 3 should Donald Trump worry the most about?
I can tell you what we have reported that his team seems to be the most worried about, and I think that's their assessment's probably pretty right, is the Florida case. I mean, I think that is the one that they are most worried about. That is it seems like a very strong case. The allegations are very serious, and I think when he thinks about president, who wants a president who has been convicted of disregarding the nation's top secrets? Now, these are all allegations right now, but I think like that one, the crime is serious, the case is strong, and the implications for his future political career are pretty severe.
All right, Perry Stein, Justice Department reporter for the Washington Post. Thank you very much for coming to First Look. Have a good weekend.
Thanks.
All right, time for the Opinions Roundtable. So let's go to the opinion side of the Washington Post, where we will find Washington Post columnists E.J. Dionne in the top Brady Bunch box and Ramesh Ponnuru in the bottom Brady Bunch box. E.J., Ramesh, welcome back to First Look.
Good to be in the family.
There's a story. This is to both of you, but EJ, I want you to go first. Donald Trump is now a convicted felon. Talk about the significance of yesterday's historic ruling.
Well, I think you started right. The words convicted felon stick with you, just like NBA MVP stick with you for a long time. And so I think that is important. I think it's very important that for all the criticisms of Alvin Bragg, he put together a good case. And I think somebody online has the Alvin Bragg apology form where you can tick various boxes. I think it's important that finally a president of the United States, yes, can be held accountable. And Donald Trump, who has had some substance stronger than Teflon attached to him for decades, couldn't stand up to this case. And I think it was really striking in this case that, and I guess Ari Melber on MSNBC was the first person I heard make this point. Trump's defense was not really looking for an acquittal because it wasn't really presenting, well, this is an alternative view of what could happen. They were just looking for a hung jury. He threw out everything he could to see if he could get one juror to say that he's not guilty and just kind of block the case that way. Last point I'd make is that we don't know, of course, how this will affect the election, but NPR, PBS Marist had a poll the day of the verdict, but before it came out, that showed 17% said that a guilty verdict would make them less likely to vote for Trump. Now, we don't know how many of those will stick, but there were significant numbers of people in small towns and in other Republican-based constituencies who said this would make a difference. The one thing we know is Donald Trump would prefer not to be a convicted felon this morning.
Ramesh?
Yes, I do think it's historic. I am worried about the long-term effects of this kind of lawfare. The New York Times reported that Bragg had his deputies scour the legal code for a charge that they could make the second charge in this case. That's not sort of the normal procedure where you target a person and then you try to figure out what crime you can possibly convince a jury that he committed. I think that's a bad precedent. I think it's one that's going to haunt our politics for some years to come. Of course, it's also the kind of precedent that Trump himself invited by starting this locker up politics in the 2016 campaign against Hillary Clinton. So it's hard to have tons of sympathy for him. He also put on a defense that conceded nothing, even obvious things, in a way that I think undermined his legal case. It's just if you pretend that you didn't have the affair and you didn't reach a non-disclosure agreement, then you make it sound as though you're concealing those things means that they're somehow illegal or shady. His better argument would have been that they're, well, shady, yes, but not illegal. And I think partly because of his own personal influence over the legal defense. That is to say, it's not just his lawyers being incompetent, it's the client interfering with the case. They made it a weaker case and they needed to.
Ramesh, I'm going to stick with you because EJ took care of his response to this question in his first response, because I was going to ask about whether this would move the needle at all for Donald Trump or President Biden in the November election. And I asked that because Washington Post national politics reporter Hannah Knowles went to Michigan and spoke with undecided voters, most of whom had no particular opinion about this trial.
Yeah, so actually my column today in the Post Online is about the gulf that we always need to keep in mind between those of us who are politically sort of consumed and follow all this news really closely and the swing voters, who many of them are very, very inattentive to politics and uninformed about it, just uninterested about it. I think it's hard to predict what the reaction is going to be. As EJ pointed out, there's consistently in polls been a percentage of Trump voters who say that they'd be less likely to support him if he is convicted. I've always taken those numbers with a grain of salt. I think people are not necessarily accurate predictors of their own political behavior, especially if their interest in politics is intermittent. And there's time for narratives to get baked in, like this was a rigged trial, for example, which will be the Republican line. But I think I'm on the third hand here. It's also true it's going to be a tight election, and so it only needs to affect a small percentage of voters for it to be decisive.
All right.
Could I say, I think that's the key point. Your third-handism is fair, balanced balance. So good for you, Ramesh. But I want to go back to something Ramesh said about the defense, which I think is important. Trump couldn't admit the obvious, and I think Ramesh is right that this was on orders from Trump. And that did undercut the defense because there were other paths to acquittal if they had acknowledged what the jury already knew. So I think they lost credibility in the way they defended the case. Second, I do want to defend Bragg. He wasn't just searching around for a charge. He had decided early on that another avenue where they were going, the DA's office before Bragg got there was going full speed ahead on a different approach. And Bragg said, I don't think this is the right approach. I think there's a better approach. And again, I think that this justifies that. And then on the last point, I do think I agree with Ramesh. We can't always predict what something that happens now is going to do to our vote 4 or 5 months from now. But I think these percentages are big enough that even if half or even if less than half of the people who say this affects them actually are affected by this, given these polls, that could make a real difference in the race.
So let's talk about this impact. The impact of this conviction on other races, particularly Republican candidates. And I'm thinking specifically of former Maryland Governor Larry Hogan, now a candidate for the U.S. Senate in Maryland. Before the verdict, he put out a what used to be called a tweet, a little missive on what's now called X. He said that everyone should respect the jury's decision. Afterwards, the senior Trump campaign official, Chris LaCivita, quote tweeted him, and this is the exact quote: "You just ended your campaign." How much of an albatross, EJ, you go first, and I would love to hear from you, Ramesh. How much of an albatross is this conviction going to be on Republican candidates, particularly Republican candidates in purple districts, or, as is the case of Maryland, a blue state?
Well, I had a conspiracy theory float through my head, which is Maryland is so anti-Trump. One poll I saw showed President Biden up by 2 to 1 in Maryland right now, that this could actually help Hogan to be attacked this way. The question is, do Trump voters, there are Trump voters in the state. Hogan lost in some really, really conservative areas in the primary that he won fairly handily. Does this discourage them at all? But to go to your larger question, I think in swing districts, it's not going to be easy for some of these Republicans to say, I stand with the convicted felon. It's not going to be easy for them to buy into the spin of the Trump people that this is outrageous, a fixed trial and all that. That won't go over well in those districts. So that I think for swing Republicans, putting Hogan aside here, in, say, House races, I think this could be problematic for them. And it's going to be very interesting to see how many of them jump on this Trump attack on the entire legal system, and how many of them try to keep their distance.
There's been a lot of reporting, EJ, that the Biden. Oh, I'm sorry, Ramesh. Oh, yes, Ramesh.
So,
I'm so
yeah.
sorry. I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
No, you weren't going to duck this question, Ramesh. I remembered in time.
Yeah, I think what is true of the presidential race will be true to a smaller degree in some of these other races. I think that this is a polarizing event, which sort of for Trump sort of raises the floor and lowers the ceiling that he can achieve. I think a lot of Republicans are going to be able to take the temperature of their own districts and reach their own decisions. I do think that there are a handful of purple and blue constituencies where you've got competitive races where it would be a problem for Republicans.
All right, EJ, now to the question I was going to ask you. There's been a lot of reporting that the Biden campaign and President Biden himself will be much more aggressive in their attacks on Trump now that he's been convicted. Smart thing to do, or should they still do what they're doing? I just saw an interview with Mitch Landrieu, who's a senior campaign official, who's still sort of floating at the 35,000-foot level by talking about how the rule of law has been preserved, that this is still a fight for democracy. But should they lower the altitude and really go after him?
Well, I think that they are a bit, they have tied themselves in a bit of a knot because they don't want in any way to play into this, I believe, false Trump narrative that this is all a fix, that Joe Biden did it, even though it's the Manhattan DA who is not under any authority of the federal government. And so they don't want to play into the Trump narrative. On the other hand, the Trump narrative is so strong that I think they need to be stronger in response. And I think what you heard from Landrieu is where they may go. I think you'll hear a lot of references from Democrats to the convicted felon, obviously. But I think what they should say is, do you want a president who is attacking the rule of law, who says just because he was actually found guilty of a crime, that gives him the right to go after all Democrats, whether they're guilty of a crime or not? I think that's where they may want to take it. The Trump threat to the rule of law, which actually has a lot of other offshoots, because the things that Democrats and a lot of other Americans are really afraid of about Trump is that he has no respect for institutions or the rule of law. So I think that's where they can go without risking this thing they're afraid of, which is sounding like they're politicizing the justice system.
Ramesh, what do you think? What's Trump's best strategy now?
Well, I think Trump's best strategy is one that he is not psychologically equipped to pursue, which is to make this race as much as possible about Biden and not about himself. I think Biden's interest is to make the race about Trump, and Trump's is to make it about Biden. But I don't know that Trump is capable of doing that. One other thing, though, I'd like to add to what EJ said on the Democratic strategy. I think there are a couple dangers here, and one is appearing to politicize the rule of law, which I think is a serious issue. But I also think there is a danger of getting the balance wrong between sort of this rule of law, democracy argument, and bread and butter issues, where I think the Democrats have points they can make on both, but they appeal to different constituencies. And I think they need to say things like, Trump still wants to repeal Obamacare. He's talking about cutting off funding for schools that have vaccine mandates. Those sorts of issues, I think, have the potential to reach a broader group of voters, or at least a different group of voters that Biden needs.
I want to say underscore something there, but I think that the democracy issue is absolutely vital for Biden because he needs a lot of suburban moderate votes, including Nikki Haley Republicans. She, by the way, picked a rather inopportune time to announce her support for Trump, but that's for another discussion. But I think they have to do both, and they do have to keep a balance, because the working class voters they need to win, and that includes white and black and Latino working class voters, are indeed much more worried about bread and butter issues. So they have to run these two simultaneous campaigns on democracy, the rule of law, the integrity of our institutions on the one hand, and I am going to make life better for you, and here's what I've done already.
EJ, I want to thank you for amplifying that working class voters include Black and Latino voters. Thank you very much for that. All right, EJ, I'm sticking with you because President Biden isn't without his political headaches. And actually, this is one of my headaches. I am so tired of reading stories about Democrats freaking out. Those are exact words, freaking out over fill in the blank issue of the day. It's like every day there's a story about Democrats freaking out. And this week there was a Politico story that said Democrats are freaking out over Biden's lingering low poll numbers. Are they right to worry?
I was talking to a Democrat a couple of days ago who said when Republicans are down in the polls, as say George W. Bush was in 2004, their thought isn't hand-wringing. Their thought is, how do we go after the other guy and bring him down? And thus you had the swift boating of John Kerry. When Democrats are in a close race or feel they're in trouble, they wring their hands. They say, oh, woe is us. So I think there's some of that. I think some people who took positions earlier that Biden shouldn't run are still invested in that position. So this is a chance for them to say, see, this is problematic. But the third fact, there is a fact here, which is that this is a very close race. And I think a lot of Democrats just can't believe that somebody like Donald Trump, with all of his well-known flaws, with the fact that he is so entirely unsuited to be president, can still manage to make this such a close race. And I think that last one, putting aside the first two, is what feeds this. But the basic truth is, it is a close race. It is a hard race. And I believe you're going to have this headache, I'm sorry to say, all the way through the election, unless this trial produces some big polling lead for Biden, which we don't think it probably will.
Yeah, it's like Democrats are always running for the lifeboats, and the ship is right there at the dock. Ramesh,
Yeah, I
uh,
think
no, go ahead, and then I have my
I think
question
there's
for you.
also a danger, though, of complacency, right? When you have Democrats saying, including reportedly Biden, the polls are wrong. I think that they're not taking the situation as seriously as they should be. Biden is very unpopular. People are unhappy about the economy. People are unhappy about the state of the country. His numbers on a host of attributes have fallen since 2020. Interestingly enough, Trump's haven't really changed. It's mostly a change in the Biden numbers. And he is facing some serious slippage in what has traditionally been core Democratic constituencies. So, that's not, there's never never a good time to panic. But this is he ought to be approaching this as an underdog.
But Ramesh, don't you think that if Biden were complacent, he would not have agreed to a debate in June? In other words, I think that, yes, they've raised problems with the polling numbers, and there are some problems with the polling numbers. And I've thought about this complacency business, but they wouldn't agree to this early debate. They wouldn't want to move the campaign in the way they have if they were genuinely complacent, don't you think?
I think the debate was one of the debate challenge that Biden put out was one of the better things that he has done recently. But I just think that there's this constant sort of pull and push in in the psychology of Democrats about how to view this election.
Yeah.
Complacency to panic is a very bad way to go.
Oh my
One might
God.
bend back and forth.
Yeah, talk about a yo-yo existence. All right, Ramesh. Okay, we've got like a couple minutes left. Ramesh, so so Donald Trump is leading, depending on which poll you look at, and if you believe that the polls are accurate. But is he leading in most polls because of something he's done, or voter dissatisfaction with Biden's record?
Oh, I think it's almost, I think it's overwhelmingly voter dissatisfaction. And if you look around the world, a lot of incumbents who have presided over high inflation are suffering in the polls as a result of that. It's not because of the political genius of Donald Trump, although I don't want to discount the cunning that he often displays in a lot of ways. Um, Biden's problem is, that prices have gone up 20% since he took office. There's a number of things he could say in his defense about that, but that is just something that is going to weigh you down with voters.
EJ,
I think there's such an irony here that in Britain, the Labour Party under Keir Starmer, a very moderate Labour leader, is overwhelming the Conservatives in the polls in an election that happens appropriately enough on July 4th. And Starmer is running on the Biden program, but is benefiting from the same anger about prices and other factors, as well as Tory incompetence, that the same sort of economic factors that are hurting Joe Biden. So he's running on Biden's program and succeeding because he's the outsider.
Okay. You guys were rather efficient today in your responses. I think we're leaving some seconds on the table. EJ Dion, Ramesh Panuru, as always, thank you very much for coming to First Look. Have a good weekend.
Great to be with you guys.
And thank you for watching. For more of these important and fun conversations, sign up for a Washington Post subscription. Get a free trial by visiting the site you see there at the bottom of the screen, WashingtonPost.com. washingtonpost.com/live. Again, Washington Post, all one word, .com/live. I'm Jonathan Capehart. Thank you for watching Washington Post Live's First Look.